Secondly, learning from animals. And again, many people find this surprising because they don't normally think of animals as having a kind of spiritual dimension. Again, I'll come back to that. Then thirdly, fasting. This is practiced in all religions, and it's also practiced in expensive health retreats, where you can pay a great deal of money to eat nothing. This is a practice which can be done for both spiritual and psychological and physical benefits. Again, I'll discuss this in more detail. Then psychedelics. Again, most people don't necessarily think of psychedelics and cannabis as having a spiritual dimension. They're usually classified as, at best, recreational drugs or drugs of abuse. But I shall discuss those again in a moment. I think they can have, for many people, a strong spiritual dimension and provide openings into the spiritual realm. And I discuss prayer as distinct from meditation. Here I'm thinking about petitionary prayer. Then holy days and festivals, which are practices found in all religions and in secular societies too, which, well, they may be not called holy days in secular societies, but special days, because these provide a very traditional way of stopping our normal activities, creating a space where other things can happen, and celebrating together. And one of the important dimensions of spiritual practices is the collective dimension. Some are much more individual, like meditation. Others are more collective, like chanting, singing together, and taking part in rituals and celebrations and festivals. And the final one is about good behavior, avoiding vices, cultivating virtues, and being kind. Because unless these spiritual practices occur within some sort of framework of good behavior, then they're just individual and rather selfish practices. You may feel great, you may have great visions, but unless it helps other people and helps the wider world, what's the ultimate good of it? So these are the 7 practices I discussed, and then at the end I come to this question: why do such practices work? Why do such different things as meditation and sports, for example, have spiritual effects when they're so completely different from each other? I'm going to start with sports. And sports, I think, are one of the principal ways in which people in the modern secular world have altered states of consciousness. They do this for a variety of reasons. One of them is that they're very effective at bringing people into the present. And here, under the name sports, I include team sports like football, and indeed watching football, individual sports like mountain climbing or free diving, or extreme sports, which are usually done by individuals, not as teams, and sports which are not normally thought of, are not games, but sports as a general term also includes things like hunting, traditional pursuits, which are called field sports. What all these different kinds of sports have in common is the exercise of physical skill and a delight in the exercise of physical skill. That's what distinguishes them from games. Some sports are games, but some games are not sports. Chess, for example, is a game but not a sport. Sports involve physical skill. And one of the things about sports is that when you're playing a sport, when you're engaged in a sport, because you have to concentrate on that physical skill, it leads to a tremendous change in the way your mind is working. We have, all of us, regions of our brain linked together which are called the default mode network. And when that network is active, what's happening is you're ruminating, you're worrying, you're thinking, you're fantasizing. There's an internal dialogue, a kind of chatter of the mind. And many meditative practices, actually all meditative practices, are designed to reduce and eliminate that as much as possible. So as you sit quietly in mindfulness meditation or in using a mantra or a repetitive phrase, you can split the mind and somehow separate from this internal dialogue in which one is normally engaged. And sometimes there are moments when it stops, and then there are often moments of great peace and joy. Now, in sports, the default mode network is shut down much more fast and much more effectively than in many forms of meditation. A friend of mine who ran a business school in the United States once told me that at his busiest time, he just couldn't stop thinking. He couldn't sleep at night, his mind was working, racing all the time. He tried meditation, it didn't work. But he's a rock climber. He said by the time he was 50 feet up a rock face, he was totally in the present. The only thing that matters was the next handhold or foothold, completely in the present. And this is true of all sports activities as you're engaged in them. If you're skiing downhill at 60 miles an hour, and if you start worrying about have you paid the gas bill, or why didn't you say something to someone to put them down after some horrible remark, or some resentment you want to dwell upon, all of that would distract you completely from the need to be totally concentrated. You go and die. So you have to be in the present. If you're in a football game, there are crowds cheering and people are passing the ball, you have to be completely in the present. So the first thing about sports is they bring us into the present and they shut down the default mode network. Many people also, through sports, have a sense of connection with something greater than themselves. In a team game, just being part of a team involves a connection greater than oneself. A kind of psychic linkage to other members of the team is common. Often football and other teams enter into a kind of state of mutual telepathy. Michael Murphy, who is one of the founders of the Human Potential Movement, who started the Esalen Institute in California in 1962, wrote a book called The Psychic Side of Sports, in which he showed that telepathic and psychic phenomena are extraordinarily common in team games. Most people don't like to talk about them because there's a taboo about such things. But when he interviewed football players in America, for example, he found that most of them said, yes, I've had that experience, but I never talk about it to fellow players in the locker room because they might think I'm weird. All of them had had this experience, yet none of them had talked about it. So there's that element, there's the psychic element, the telepathic connection. But there's also a sense of being connected with something much greater than oneself. Michael Murphy also wrote a book called Golf in the Kingdom, which has sold over 1 million copies worldwide. It is a kind of cult book among golfers. I'm not one myself, but it's something which brings out a kind of spiritual dimension of the game of golf. And of course, in the Orient, arts, the martial arts and other physical skills have an explicit spiritual dimension. This first became apparent in the West in the 1950s with a famous book by Herigel, a German, who wrote a book called Zen and the Art of Archery. He studied for years in Japan with a Zen master, just firing arrows. And what this master made very clear to him was that it wasn't just a matter of hitting the target. It was a complete change in state of mind, just an absorption into a process of flow. Doing by not doing, and there was all sorts of paradoxical language he used. And this led to a series of books in the West recognizing this dimension of sports. The martial arts themselves, of course, recognize this because they're not just about landing a heavy punch on the opponent or brute force. They're about skill and flow, and they make it clear, those of you who studied martial arts will know that it's about flow and how you're part of the process of flow, which is not just your physical energy, but it's part of being a flow that goes all through nature, and it's a sense of connecting with a greater flow. So this is explicit in the Eastern world, but much less so in the Western world. In fact, Michael Murphy thinks of sports as the yoga of the West. This also brings us to think about what is it about the sports that involve speed, the thrill of speed, which is a part of some sports, particularly important in the 20th century as sports got faster and faster. Downhill skiing became more and more popular. snowboarding, surfing, skydiving, motorcycle racing, car racing. There's something about speed which is immensely attractive to people. And why should that be? It's certainly not to do with, unless you're in a competitive motorcycle race, it's not primarily to do getting ahead or making money or anything like that. It's about an experience. And what is it about that experience? I think it's partly, again, this demand for complete concentration. The motive force in these sports is not your own muscles. You can run fast, you can swim fast if you're good at running and swimming. But these sports are about some other source of force, gravity in the case of skiing, the engine in a motorcycle or a car or a jet plane. And what you're doing is modulating those movements through relatively small movements of your own, but you're just riding the edge of what is an effective way of doing it, and death, because what happens if you get any of these things wrong is you're dead, and many of these sports are in fact lethal. The death rate in motorcycle racing is exceptionally high, for example. And then there's a whole range of extreme sports, like base jumping, jumping off cliffs or high skyscrapers, and so on, and opening the parachute at the last moment, or having kind of flaps on your wings and gliding down. About 1 in 60 base jumpers dies. These are extremely dangerous sports, and people do them, I think, precisely because they're so dangerous, precisely because you're on that razor's edge of survival. You have to be totally in the present, and I think that's why people do them. It's otherwise paradoxical. We live in a world obsessed, as no one has ever been obsessed before, with health and safety, and yet what attracts a lot of people in this world is sports which are the exact opposite. They're as unsafe as they could possibly be. Jumping out of a plane at 10,000 feet. They're jumping off a tall skyscraper with a flimsy parachute that might not open. These things attract a lot of people, and they attract them precisely because they put them on that edge. And another aspect of sports is that they push people to extraordinary lengths of pain and endurance. In the Middle Ages, some people, out of religious devotion, underwent this sort of thing through extreme austerities and things like self-flagellation. It now happens primarily through sports. There's a whole range of incredibly grueling sports events, including the Badwater Ultra Marathon in Death Valley, California. And here's a description, which it happens in July, when the temperatures in the daytime reach 129 Fahrenheit or 54 Celsius. And one of the participants described his experience as follows. If there was a place where human limitation, but also the limits of explanation and reason and science should hit the wall, this was it. Badwater was a perch from which I could look for the definitions of what we are, what makes us stop and what makes us go. Maybe spirituality wasn't quite the word for it, but I was enough of a believer, or a seeker at least, to think that there might be a way to reach the veil and touch something beyond me in my life, a place where misery and transcendence were so deeply intertwined it could not be without meaning. So you see, the realm of sports isn't just about equipment and being fit. There's these other sides to it which are not far beneath the surface. I have an appeal for information about this on my website at the moment, and I'm having stories flooding in. Every day I get several new stories, amazing stories about people's experiences in the context of sports. Well, let me move on now to the second topic in this book, which is learning from animals. There's, I think, quite a few ways in which we can learn from non-human animals, including wild animals and also domestic animals, the animals we know best, like dogs and cats, horses, parrots, and other animals that people have as parts of their daily lives. I think one of the things we can learn from animals is that because animals don't have language, they presumably don't have the default mode network in the same way we do. Animals don't spend their life in internal chatter about imagining terrible things that might happen in the future or dwelling on resentments from the past. They live much more in the present than we do. We have to go to great lengths, so like extreme sports or meditation, to come into the present. But many animals can do that in the most uncomplicated way. A cat purring, for example, is unmistakably in the present and feeling happy. It's not ruminating or worrying that it didn't catch a mouse yesterday or that it might not get the thing tomorrow. It's just happy to be there in the present. And that's the aim of most spiritual practices, is to come into the present. Animals don't have the problem of getting out of it as much as we do. So just by being with a cat when it's purring, and instead of stroking it distractedly while watching television or something, just being present with the cat is a way of coming into the present. Another thing that animals can teach us is unconditional love. Dogs, most of all. There's somebody once said, you see a dog for sale, and that's the only kind of love that money can buy. Dogs are often intensely loyal and own with their owners, and show them unconditional love. And this can have healing effects. Dogs and cats and other animals actually have a healing power. Partly this is demonstrated by the fact that they're often taken into hospitals and hospices because they have a kind of therapeutic effect on people who are there. And there have now been a lot of scientific studies of people who are seriously ill or who've had serious operations that show that people who have dogs or cats at home tend to get better, very significantly more than those that don't. These animals have an actual healing presence. When I married Jill, my wife, Jill Peirce, she had a cat which was called Remedy. And she called the cat Remedy because Remedy was a remedy. She found that if she was upset, Remedy would sit on her and purr and cheer her up. If she was ill, Remedy would come and lie beside her and show warmth and affection. It made her feel better. And she actually got better quicker, I'm sure, as a result of this. I think there are other ways in which we can learn from animals. One of them is through their psychic abilities. Animals, generally speaking, have better psychic powers than we do. They have a better sensitivity to things that are going to happen in the future. Animals often give warnings of earthquakes or tsunamis long before any human being knows about them. This could be employed scientifically and could act as an animal-based warning system. In fact, when the Chinese tried that in the 1970s, they succeeded in predicting earthquakes, whereas Western seismologists who rely only on scientific instruments have always failed in short-term prediction of earthquakes. So they're more sensitive about what's going to happen with premonition. Many animals are also more telepathic, and I think they're telepathic with each other in the wild, but when they're domesticated, they often become telepathic with their human companions. Some of you know that I wrote a book called Dogs That Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home, which is about dogs that know when their owners are coming home. And also about cats and other animals that know when their owners are coming home. Many dogs pick up their owner's intention to come home. And we know this is not just routine and so on. We've done hundreds of videotaped experiments, which you can see some of them online on my website. There's papers in scientific journals about this, and I summarise it in that book. People can come home at randomly chosen times. We choose the time, they don't. They're at least 5 miles from home. They come home in unfamiliar vehicles, so there's no familiar car sounds. It's not a routine time. No one at home knows when they're coming. We film the dog the whole time they're out. And when they form the intention to come home, these dogs then start waiting at the door for them. They're picking up their intention. Now, similar phenomena occur in the human realm. Many mothers find that when their baby needs them, they can pick up the baby's need even from miles away. Many nursing mothers have found their milk lets down when their baby needs them. I've done studies on this with 19 different nursing mothers in London, and shown that this is way beyond chance coincidences. There's odds against chance of about 1 billion to 1 in the series of tests that I ran. This seems to be a real phenomenon. And the commonest kind in the human realm is telephone telepathy. You think of someone who then rings. And again, I've done many experiments on that, summarized in my book, The Sense of Being Stared At, and other aspects of the extended mind. I have an online test you can try yourself. It works on mobile phones, and it's fun to do. The evidence is overwhelming. It's not just chance coincidence. In our tests, we have a minimum of 2, sometimes 4 callers. We pick the caller at random. You're the receiver. You're being filmed on those rigorous tests. The phone rings. You know it's one of these 4 people. But you can't know from any normal understanding of their patterns who it is, because we pick them at random. You have to guess who it is before you answer the phone. You're either right or you're wrong. And by pure guessing, you'll be right 25% of the time. In fact, people are right about half the time in these experiments, way above chance, very significantly so. We have these psychic abilities. Animals have them better than us, and they help to show us the difference between the psychic and the spiritual. Psychic abilities are about mental connections and emotional connections above all, at a kind of horizontal level, with other people or with animals. The premonitions of animals about earthquakes, or sometimes humans have premonitions too, less often than animals, are about things that are going to happen in the external environment. So these all show that the mind is more extensive than the brain, which is why they're controversial within the materialistic scientific world, because the materialist assumption is the mind is nothing but the brain, so these things ought not to happen, which is why there's tremendous opposition to evidence for them. People saying they can't possibly happen, all the evidence must be fraudulent or flawed because they're impossible. They're only impossible if you have this very narrow view of the nature of the mind. So I think our minds are more extended than our brains, as psychic phenomena show. But the spiritual phenomena suggest that our minds are part of a greater consciousness that's not just horizontal, but as it were all around us, much more than just connecting with other people or animals, connecting with something beyond the human and the animal realm. There is, of course, the question as to whether animals themselves can have spiritual experiences. Some people assume that only humans can have spiritual experiences because humans are vastly superior to animals, and animals, the official scientific view is that they're just mechanisms, machines that have evolved, programmed by selfish genes, evolved by processes of blind chance and natural selection. So if you take that view, and rational minds are the only things that make us really valuable, which is a common view in the modern world, then animals are very inferior. If you take the view that all of nature comes forth from a kind of conscious source that reflects the ultimate consciousness or ultimate reality, the minds of animals may have direct access to it just as we do. In fact, I suspect that some animals may have more spiritual experiences than we do, because they're so much less confused by the default mode network type activities that take them out of the present. I think that when blackbirds are singing and listening to other blackbirds singing, singing apparently for the joy of singing, I mean, it's of course a sexual selection thing in spring, but it goes way beyond the call of duty. For just sexual selection, this extraordinarily beautiful variation of song that happens, and they have duets with neighbouring, they're listening to each other, interacting in a duet form. I think they're enjoying that in the same way we can enjoy music, taking us into something beyond ourselves. I think when dolphins are leaping in the bow wave of a boat, you see just enjoy the sheer joy of movement and exercise of skill. That's the same kind of pleasure that humans may have in physical skills. I think a lizard basking in the sun may be in a state of sort of blissful state of absorption in the ultimate. Why not? I mean, I think that these windows into the ultimate consciousness may occur quite commonly throughout the animal kingdom. Maybe to some animals more than others, and at sometimes more than others, of course. I can't prove that, but no one can prove that they don't have spiritual experiences either. We have to guess when it comes to animals. And of course, in some cultures, animals are treated as sacred. In India, many of you, if you've been there, will have seen cows in the middle of busy roads and all the traffic goes around them because they're sacred cows. Elephants are sacred. So if you go to a temple in South India, at the entrance to the temple, you stand there and there's usually an elephant at the entrance gate to the temple. If you stand there, the elephant will bring its trunk over, touch you on the top of the head to give you a blessing. It's a really nice thing to have. Then the trunk sort of swivels round and comes here, waiting for a 10 rupee note. Then gives it to the
That must have been bad.
So animals, I think we can learn from in ways that can be spiritually helpful. Now I come to fasting. Fasting occurs in all religious traditions. Hindus have various fast periods during the year. Muslims, of course, fast during Ramadan, no food or drink between sunrise and sunset. Many Christians fast during Lent and Advent, which are the main fasting periods of Ramadan and Lent. Jewish people fast at Yom Kippur. So fasting is present in all traditions. In many shamanic traditions, they have fasting as well. It often happens before festivals or before rituals or particularly important ceremonies. Usually feasts are preceded by fasts. The Feast of Christmas is preceded by the fast of Advent. The Feast of Easter is preceded by the fast of Lent. And even relatively minor festivals in people who are strictly observant within the Christian tradition involve fasting the previous day or at least the previous evening. So there's fasting just built in. And actually fasting and feasting are a kind of reflection of the way we've evolved. No animals, or no living organisms really, apart from plants which will run on light, but animals and humans have all evolved under conditions of intermittent food supply. Most animals don't, in the natural world, get 3 regular meals a day, every single day of the year. They have periods when there's a shortage of food, depending on the seasons or depending on the luck of the kill in the case of predators. They have periods when there's an excess of food, with plenty of food around. So there's these periods of, it's not really fasting because it's not voluntary, fasting is voluntary, but periods of food deprivation and periods when there's more food. This is how all organisms have evolved, really. And it turns out that these periods of caloric restriction or food deprivation are actually highly beneficial to most animals. If you deprive bacteria like E. coli of food for part of their life, they live much longer as a result. So do yeast cells, so do worms, so do insects like fruit flies, and so do mice. If you, in one experiment, where mice were fed every alternate day instead of every day, so they only got 50% of the time they were eating. You may have had a bit more when they were eating, but overall they were eating less than the other mice, and they had every other day as a period of fasting. They lived 30% longer, and massive extension of lifespan. The simplest way to expand, to rejuvenate organisms and to extend their life. The elixir of life turns out to be no elixir at all. It turns out to be nothing, not having anything to eat. This fasting has enormous physiological benefits in many animals. There's been less research on it in humans because it doesn't fit into the biomedical model. And drug companies obviously aren't going to pay for research on fasting. It doesn't benefit them in any way, nor are food companies. So the people who've done most research on this are naturopaths. They're the ones who know most about it. Most regular doctors don't learn about it at medical school or practice fasting themselves. And they're often rather afraid of it. They tend to say things like, everyone needs a good breakfast, if you bring the subject up, as I've discovered myself. Not a very nuanced approach to the subject. Well, it turns out that if you're fasting, the cellular repair systems swing into action in a big way. Senescent cells and bits of cellular debris which clog up our system, and some of which seem to help to nucleate diseases like Alzheimer's. These are mopped up in fasting, they're broken down. And when you're fasting, the pituitary gland secretes growth hormone, which leads to a regeneration of the whole cellular system in the body. There's immensely beneficial effects can flow from fasting in humans and other animals. So fasting turns out to have great advantages physically and also spiritually. When you're fasting, it's easier to pray and meditate. People often have more vivid dreams. It's easier to concentrate. I myself have fasted every year for more than 30 years. I do it during Lent. I'm a practicing Christian, I'm an Anglican. And so I do it in Holy Week, usually, just the week leading up to Lent. Between 3 and 7 consecutive days with just water. I do take multivitamin pills one a day just to avoid mineral deficiencies and psyllium husks to provide fibre to stop the system clogging up. You get constipated otherwise. But fasting, it has an amazing effect really. I mean, the first day you feel hungry. But by the end of the second day, the hunger pangs diminish and it's much, much easier. The first time you do it, you often get a headache because there's a kind of flushing out of toxins from the fat cells. But during fasting, you're basically burning up fat. And we've all got huge amounts of fat stored in our bodies, and some more than others, obviously. But calculations show that the average American could walk all the way from New York to Florida without eating anything at all, just on the basis of fat in their body. Wow. And in one clinical study in the north of England, a very obese young man was put on a clinical fast, observed by doctors, eating nothing for 382 days. At the end of that period, he was much, much healthier than when he started, and of course he lost a lot of weight. It's not a perfect method for weight loss, if you think, well, that's a good way. You do lose weight, obviously, when you're fasting, but unless you change your diet and lifestyle, you usually put it on again. But you still get the benefits of fasting. Now, I don't want to make it sound as if I think everyone should fast. Some people definitely shouldn't. The people who are suffering from anorexia, bad idea. People who've had a disease and lost a lot of weight, bad idea. If you're suffering from diabetes, you should do it under controlled conditions because you may have a very low blood sugar, but it can benefit and even cure type 2 diabetes. I think many people can just do it without too much worry, but if you have any doubts and you want to do it, best to seek expert advice. And the best experts are naturopaths, because they're the ones who actually learn about it, practice it, and have more than 100 years pioneered the use of fasting for health benefits. It also has the effect of creating much more space in the day, because all the time taken up with preparing and eating food is no longer taken up in that way. It leads also to changes in consciousness. As you burn up fats, you produce what are called ketone bodies, breakdown products of fats. The three main ones are acetoacetic acid, beta-hydroxybutyric acid, and acetone. And that's why the blood of people who are fasting has these in it, and it gives a sweetish smell to the urine and breath of people who are fasting. It's called ketosis. Now, beta-hydroxybutyric acid is very closely related to one of the leading neurotransmitters, gamma-aminobutyric acid, GABA, which is the most important neurotransmitter in our brains. And when you're fasting, GABA levels go up in the brain. Beta-hydroxybutyric acid is also very closely related to gamma-hydroxybutyric acid, which is a neurotransmitter, and also a street drug, GHB, which people take because it gives this feeling of euphoria, and some people say it's an aphrodisiac. So there are these psychoactive effects of fasting. So it's not surprising that people, when fasting, often undergo altered states of consciousness. The Librium and Valium family of drugs work on the GABA transmitter system. So we've got a whole lot of psychoactive effects which fasting can help to bring about. Now, when we come to explicitly psychoactive compounds like cannabis and psychedelics, I think that those two can have a spiritual dimension. In India, where cannabis has been taken for centuries, if not millennia, it's recognized by many people to have this spiritual dimension. Many sadhus, those orange-robed figures that congregate at the Kumbh Mela and that go all over India and pilgrimages and so on, smoke cannabis as part of their practice. They think it's Shiva's holy plant, and they think it gives a connection with the divine. Now, obviously, for most people in Britain today, cannabis is not taken as a spiritual practice. It's taken a bit like drinking beer in a pub, or something that makes you feel happy, fun to do with friends, enhances the enjoyment of music. But it can be taken with a spiritual dimension, and some people actually do it. There's a small underground movement called Cathedrals on Cannabis, consisting of people who find that taking cannabis before entering the great sacred space can enormously enhance the spirit, the feeling of being in that space, the connection you feel with it, and the inspiration that can come through it. And again, I'm not saying advocating everyone smoking cannabis. It's illegal here, so I can't advocate it. But it's now legal in places like California and many parts of the United States. It's now legal in the whole of Canada. And so there are places where it can actually be taken in spiritual context. To do research on this, I looked online to see what's happening in America where it's now legal. And sure enough, there's a whole ferment of activity. There's a whole Jewish movement. Some Jewish rabbis have opened cannabis dispensaries. And there's a Jewish ceremony at the end of the Sabbath or at the end of festivals called Havdalah, which is a feast which involves smelling smelling spices, drinking wine with a cup filled to the brim, and so on. Many Jewish people in Colorado and elsewhere have now started using cannabis-infused bagels as part of their Havdalah ceremony, and find it greatly enhances the festivity and the spiritual dimension. And from Colorado, I found a series of online discussion forums from cannabis-fueled Bible study groups in various fundamentalist churches, where one woman said, "This is giving me the experience of Jesus I always hoped for." So we're in a time of change at the moment. And when we come to other psychedelics, we find that some of them have been used in traditional cultures for many years. In West Africa, iboga, a very psychoactive compound, has been used in healing ceremonies. In the region of the Amazon, a mixture of two plants, it's called ayahuasca, has been used in shamanic healing and initiation ceremonies for centuries. No one knows how long, but it must go back a long time. In Mexico, there's been long-standing use of psychedelic mushrooms, again in shamanic contexts and ceremonies. Ayahuasca is probably the best known of these traditional substances now, because many people go to Peru to have ayahuasca ceremonies with shamanic leaders or neo-shamanic leaders. I mean, they're not obviously all traditional shamans in remote villages. You can now undergo an ayahuasca training course through online for a modest fee. So it's now being heavily commercialized, but the fact is many people are doing this and are finding it helpful, spiritually helpful, as not just a trip. Perhaps the most interesting of these religious psychedelic groups are the psychedelic churches which have emerged in Brazil. Christian missionaries, Catholic missionaries, sent missionaries into the jungle to evangelize tribes who traditionally took ayahuasca. Within a few decades, what had emerged was